So thanks for agreeing for a call, and yeah, the initial message was about I follow your work for a while, and I really like what you're doing with the Glamorous Toolkit. And I find you and other people in a weird space between industry and academia, and I was interested in knowing more about, like, how do you perceive yourself and how do you perceive Glamorous Toolkit in that sense. And since it's going to be recorded and probably shared, I decided to, like, make it a little bit wider, to because I've seen many presentations you have given related to Glamorous Toolkit as a tool and the ideas of the tool, but I'm really interested in you and the design process that took you to the tool as it is, and how do you feel like both you and the tool fit in the current state of software. So I don't know, and if anything it's not interesting for you or you don't want to talk about it, it's okay. I will just throw ideas I have in my head and you answer as long or short as you like for each, if you
Sure.
think. And first, I would like to make, and now that's being recorded, I want to avoid annoying people. I want to make an initial disclaimer, which is I'm not saying, like, my feeling is that I see, like, industry and academia as like a symbiosis, like two things that should have feedback loops and should work together to deliver together a thing. And I've seen lately a little bit of a split or a space in the middle that I don't know if one or the other or both are not feeling, or if it's a third place that you may be feeling, in a sense. And so the idea is to talk about that. And so my first question is just, how do you answer what you do? Because in a sense, you are kind of an entrepreneur, you're a founder of a company, but you're kind of also a researcher, you're creating something new. But I see also, in a sense, that you're kind of also a designer, because you're, like, building a new tool that I think you wanted to, like, allow people to do new, different things, or easier, more things, or whatever. So how do you see yourself or describe yourself when somebody asks you what you do for a living? What do you answer?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. Like when we get to, like, it's difficult to put ourselves in a box that is easily explainable. But so yeah, indeed, the way it's all of those things that you mentioned are correct. But the reason we created the company was to have a vehicle to fund the work, and to fund it in a way that does not tie the results of the work to the funding, or at least that was the original intent, and it still is. Um, but so now still, of course, as a as a company, you have to earn money. So the way we earn money is by solving difficult problems, or problems that are perceived to be difficult by others. And the reason we can do that is because what we are saying the industry should do works, or it seems to work. So that's the reason why. So we never we try not to sell. Well, we never, until now, we never sold uh, anything that hasn't been done before. So all the research is part, or the creation part, is completely decoupled from the projects that we do on a, so that earn us money to continue the funding. Also the other part is that we're not maximizing the profit, the consulting side, because again, like, the consulting has two parts, in fact. It has, on the one hand, like, okay, yeah, we get money, but on the other side is we get to validate our claims. So in all the projects we carry on, we are using both our tools and the techniques that we develop. And we work with customers that want us to tell them what to do rather than we accomplishing what they think should be done. So we are not a typical outsourcing. We're not doing outsourcing. We literally solve problems that people say, I don't know how to solve this. So what other kind of problems are those? So let's say if somebody has some legacy system, they need to move it from A to B, and they need to move it from A to B because of some business problem. So or a business challenge. Let's say you have an opportunity on the market, you need to scale 10x. How do you do that? Or you already have a significant amount of like you already have an interesting outlook, but you have to grow your team 2x for the foreseeable future every year, let's say. So how do you do that? And how do you scale it in a way that after you've scaled, people still know what's happening inside the company or inside the systems that you build? But it can also be companies that maybe startups that want to explore a domain without having to implement the full solution before they understand that domain. So now these are they are perceived to be very, very different kinds of problems, right? And then you would think, well, how could you possibly approach them in the same way? I mean, you have legacy on the one hand, you have something organizational on the other hand, you have some new some sort of domain exploration, and yet that's exactly what we do. So for all of these projects, we use this new way of thinking that we are calling moldable development, and we are employing Glamorous Toolkit. And basically, this is how we bootstrap the whole research, essentially. So that's a kind of a short story. It's not short, but it's a story of how we work and how we, at least how we marry the two parts on how we earn money versus how we are creating new systems. Perhaps also about the motivation. Our long-term goal is to make the inside of software systems explainable. Today, systems are not, like, we meet routinely teams that do not know how their systems work. And so let's say you have a team that worked on a system for 10 years and they cannot draw the system how it is today. They are not able to. So it's not like they don't want to. It's also not like they don't have pictures. They do have pictures about their systems, but they're wrong. So they don't know the systems. That's what it means, right? They know screens of the systems. Right? They know 50 lines at a time. They can understand those, but not the system as a whole. And that's not an isolated problem. We see it everywhere. It's literally like we haven't seen a place which does not have this problem. And so we started the company in 2015, but I started this work 12 years ago. And since then, that's all I'm doing. I'm just looking at how people are reasoning about their existing software and figuring out what they should do next and how they should go about, approaching the next step. So that's that's where it started. So that's our goal. Now, to do that, right, what moldable development is this simple idea that everything about software is data, and the reason so the way we should approach that data is through custom tools. So it's important that the tools are custom because software is highly, highly contextual. And so because it's highly contextual, we don't know the question that people will have. So because we don't know the questions, we can't give you a clicking tool. So, right, it's this idea of moldability, that you have an environment with which you create a custom, you support a custom question, becomes then it becomes essential. So, and then from there, there's a whole lot of skills, or not skill, they're just a couple of skills, but there's a whole lot of implications that go all the way to how you think about the business as a whole, like how the business thinks about the business, not just about how do we solve technical problems. But it's one of those, probably lucky, I guess, um, situations where we stumbled across one thing that, or one point of view that seems to have large effects. And so, for example, today we are looking at also similarities between moldable development and, for example, if you look at test-driven development, right? 20 years ago, it was completely unnatural. 20 years ago, you would have people that would do testing manually, and like I still remember vividly talking with people that were just saying, "Oh, we don't need test-driven development because we are already automating the report of the manual testers." Um, so that was yeah, it's a very interesting thing, right? And then then we also, when you look, for example, a decade after that, like 2010-ish, you got DevOps, right? And at that time, people were saying, well, I don't need DevOps because I'm going from 1 time a year of release to 2 times per year of release, right? And indeed, yeah, when you look at costs, right, then you see, yeah, there's some sort of automation happened there, but they missed the point. Like they missed the whole point of what happens when you have these super tight feedback loops and the kinds of behaviors that are possible after that. So, for example, if you have take DevOps, the kinds of offerings that you get today on the market were, to most people, completely unpredictable 10 years ago. They're just not, they're very difficult to imagine before you have experienced that feedback loop. And so moldable development, we think it's the next type of similar feedback loops, in that what we are basically commoditizing is, right, so testing, commoditize the running of a test, DevOps, commoditize a single deployment. We want to commoditize the answer to a question. So, because that's currently where the bottlenecks are. It's people do not lack the will to change systems. They lack the ability to know what needs to change, how they could change it. And we see when we talk with people, for example, with legacy systems, we see two kinds of fears that play at the same time. And those are, on the one hand, you have the fear of changing, because you just don't know what will break. And then on the other hand, you have the fear of not changing, because you know that if you don't change, your existence is threatened. So being in between those two concomitant fears, right? It's incredibly paralyzing. It's highly frustrating. And that, I believe, is also one of the reasons why when we ask people, do you love working with legacy systems? Right? People say, no, no, right? And that's terrible, right? That shouldn't, that there's no reason for it to be like that. There's absolutely no reason. And it's actually not even that hard to change. So anyway, that's where the motivation comes from. So now what Glamorous Toolkit is what we think is like, it has two roles. On the one hand, we don't just want to talk about things because nobody listens to people talking anymore, or arguing. People need to see very, very quickly. So Glamorous Toolkit is there so people can see. But on the other hand, is also a vehicle with which we can explore. So it's also a research vehicle. And we definitely don't think that Glamorous Toolkit is the ultimate tool, because it's not. Yeah, we do want, but we want it to become the tool that ignites the conversation, because that's what we think that ultimately is missing. We as an industry, we don't talk about this largest cost, the largest cost that we have today, and which is also the largest bottleneck. So that's what we want to achieve. And if we would achieve that, then we'd be very happy. So
yeah, so I was taking some notes, and then you can comment on whatever I say. And so what I, and now I get a better like understanding, or the word toolkit in Glamorous Toolkit like makes more sense, and it's not like a random word name you just picked. It's the toolkit used to go and work with really custom customers or needs and use it yourself to help them, like and I took another note, like the difference between the map and the territory. They may have a map or some maps, but it's so detached from the actual territory that it's or it's not complete. So they are kind of blind. They don't want to make changes because they don't know like how close the maps are to the territory and those unexplored areas, and what happens if we do something, what happens there where we don't see anything, or maybe outdated or wrong or whatever. And yeah, also you said like with legacy systems, they don't have a complete idea of what the thing is in this point in time, because it evolved for so much time and there was so many people involved that nobody has a complete perspective of the system as it is right now, as it's running. And Fred Brooks talked about that when he is involved in a project, he says, bring me somebody that knows the complete system and can explain it to me. And if the other side says there's nobody that understands the complete system, he knows that like there's a problem. And what you're trying to do with this toolkit is to start exploring and mapping the actual territory and get it an up-to-date and real like map of the actual thing. And I think you follow, or you have even worked with Wordly maps. And you mentioned this of commoditizing and that your toolkit, you're trying to build a toolkit that you can reuse across different like projects that are really custom or different, and you want to move it from like we build custom tools for each project, for each need, into like a reusable set of tools that you can move across projects. Is that like what do you think about that?
Okay, so there are a few points there. Let's take them one at a time. So when we do build, let's say, visualizations of the system, but the way we like the kind of services that we provide, we actually want to solve the problem. We want to get the company solve the problem, which is different than saying here's a visualization. There are many visualizations. There are many tools out there that provide visualizations, and they never solve the problem. Because if they would work, then people would like we would see lots of successes with people using the magic tool and trying to just being very successful and understanding their own system. So it doesn't seem to happen. Which is in fact one of the reasons why I got to this idea in the first place. So I was looking at I was writing a paper, and very often at the time my area was software analysis, software evolution. Very often at the time we would talk about this 50% of the time developers spend reading code. And it hit me once that the oldest reference I knew about the topic was dated back to 1979. So my question was, what happened for 30, 40 years now? Because if we still have the same problem that people observed decades before, and it's not for the lack of effort, but we still get the same results, right? Even if we put so much effort into it, can it be that we're actually asking the wrong question, or we're trying to solve it the wrong way? And when I started to do consulting, I basically was looking, well, what would be the interest, the magic tool, right? Because like we've built tools. So during the research, we built this project which is called Moose, which was again was a platform that pretty much was built for with the purpose of creating or just exploring faster questions and writing more papers. In a way. Now, maybe not quite like that, but it was a heavy focus on the idea of quickly creating a platform so that we can accelerate the experiments that we want to do, and then the creation of hypotheses. But that was like mostly, targeted towards just, oh, let's write another paper. But then that game became, quickly boring. So and then the question was, oh, let's go and solve some real problems, because now we have solved you can build all these interesting visualizations and it looked nice and colorful and everything. Let's solve real problems. And then you go to the first one, and then the question, so yeah, I can build like 1,000 tools, but I just don't know which one. Let's see. So we're going to go and do some consulting and solve problems, and then see which of the 1,000 tools possible are the ones that make people happiest the most, or quicker. And so we started with the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, and then by the time I got to the fifth one or so, I realized, well, the only repeatable thing was that I had to tweak something in the tool to be able to answer some question, to be able to be relevant to whatever the people have. Like I could produce pictures, but they had no impact on the reality of what people were doing. And that's it's hard to explain, but like when I go to it's interesting that, Mr. Brooks has that heuristic, because like I don't ask that, because I know that people don't. I simply ask, when was the last time the tools you used influenced the way you make a decision? And people have tools. They have static analysis tools. They have visualizations of this and that, but they don't use them because they are generic. They just produce beautiful things, but they lack the exact ingredient that makes them relevant. So they are not relevant. So without the tools, there's no reason to ask whether people believe they know the system, because that's irrelevant. I know that they cannot know the system, because it's simply impossible. So, but what we can do is we can still provide accurate answers to questions. That is something we can do. Knowing everything about the system would literally need to know the details about the system, which you won't, because there are just too many. You probably have millions of, or if you're, in a broader space, you're probably into the billions of details. You're just not going to fit those in your brain, but you don't have to, because we can get our tools to deal with those. Not all details are interesting, but the question is which ones are not, right? So you can't, when people talk, we can go into this one maybe later, but this whole idea of architecture, for example, I think it's completely upside down today. But let's park this one for a second. So you talked, talk about wordly maps. So let me maybe share the screen on how we work with how do we use wordly maps to map what we are doing, for example, in case of a legacy system. So this is our company, it's called feenk, and the way this works, right, is you have some sort of a crisis or a challenge, and you have this one is always related to a specific problem, and then your goal is to make an assessment and figure out what to do next. So that's the goal. And then the biggest problem today is that this specific problem is actually today is supported by these manual views that are basically gathered through some sort of manual inspection, right? When people are just asking other people about what they want to do, or what they think the system is, right? And some people know this, some people know that, and somehow they piece it together. And this is a manual process. And that's the reason why when we see a picture and says, when you get the author of the picture and said, can you bet your salary that the picture is real? And they like, we have yet to meet anybody that would say that is true. So once you know that, then you know how this one is done. You can also take a look at this by just looking at the picture, and if you see that some labels are not exactly aligned, it's very likely that it was made by hand. And then once it's made by hand, it documents it's still an important document, but it documents the belief of the author. It doesn't document the system. Both, they're still a relevant input, still an interesting perspective, but it is not the same thing. And it is not what the goal of it's not what should be used for deciding about the system. But so when we see a picture like that, we're actually saying that this is a source of hypothesis. Okay, this is a hypothesis about what the system looks like. So let's see, does this hold? Does it not hold? In which way does it not hold? So the way you want to do that is you want to basically commoditize these custom views, essentially. And the way this one works is that we take this manual inspection work and we create custom tools through it. So some little snippets or little effort spent on building these little tools that will generate this view. So there's a manual work here, but the commoditization is of these generated custom views. And of course, now to make this one possible, you have to make the creation of these custom tools inexpensive. And this is the whole idea of moldable tools. So we go from currently, the reason why people read code, for example, today, that's the whole idea of, they say, well, on the one hand, it's because they want to, they want to know what the system is, but the reason they read it is because they perceive it as being text, and because the tools that we are exposed to never really allow us to do anything else with the system than consider it as being text. And they're too rigid, right? So if I take two screenshots of two different systems, screenshots of the development environment going from system A and system B, and I stay like 1 meter away, there's no way for me to know which is which. Right? But if I take two apps, for example, like I just go to two different websites, I will distinctly understand they are different immediately, like without me having to go and read text. There's an ability that we have to digest lots of information. It's not accurate information, but it's at the least an interesting filter, right? That we are current tools that engineers are facing are not exploiting. In fact, they're hindering, right? So that's the difference between these rigid tools and moldable tools. And so, yeah, that's how we are creating these views. So that's so for example, we use wordly maps to explain where moldable development fits. But the essence here is still on the solving the crisis. That is the problem. So you can think of it like, say it's 2010-ish or so, and you've already seen DevOps work in real situations, right? And then people can say, oh, get me my deployment to be faster. That's one way, one kind of thing. But then if you already know, what if, like, instead of that, you do, well, let's go and change the business to have a different business model that will embrace this new opportunity. And that's another way of adding value. And then we are in the second category. So we're already talking about, what happens, how do you change your process? How do you communicate with business? What happens when business understands you can take a question from the business, open the development environment, and pair with them live? What happens then? Like, what happens when the business does not have to wait for a month for a report about whatever, or a week or a day? What happens if you can get answers like in 10 minutes? Like, imagine a scenario where a business person comes in, asks a question, and a developer says, oh, stay next to me. opens a development environment, and then in 10 minutes the problem is addressed, and then the person goes away. Is what kind of feedback loop is possible then? Like, what kind of value can you create? So that's what we are basically focusing on. Now, so it's not, now there's one thing that you mentioned at the end is, should these tools be reusable? And the thing is that no, they don't. In fact, you know, when moldable development works, most tools, we create dozens of tools per day. And a tool can be as cheap as here's a query and that I'm going to use. Here's a refactoring that I just scripted. Here's a visualization of whatever I'm looking at. And if I can amortize the investment in that tool, the first time I use the tool, if it's already profitable the first time I use the tool, I don't have to store it. So you can think of it differently. If you take a query against a database, right? There used to be a time when querying the database was a difficult thing, and people would actually log, or they would keep an index of the kinds of queries that they've ever written, because it was so hard to figure those out. Right? But then today, it's no longer hard to create a query. So most queries that are being developed are actually thrown away because you get the profit out of that little tool the first time you use it. And in fact, this is the major transformation that happened in what is today called data science, right? Is that you go from, here's a question, let's see, I'm interested in the outcome of it. And then, but the process of actually producing that outcome is often just made out of little tiny queries or visualizations or tries that are actually being thrown away at the end. And very often, even a whole notebook, which is a whole argument, is there for, you know, for the course of the decision. And then again, it's being not particularly maintained, or it doesn't even have to necessarily be maintained because it served the purpose. So it's a new opportunity that does not start with worry about whether some tool is reusable, right? And then this one then changes the perspective. So I'm never going to question, you know, is this worth it? I'll just do it because I. So.
Yeah, I was taking some notes. What I want to contextualize my question from before, like the reusable, like the difference between the tools you create in a project and the toolkit. I meant the toolkit being reusable, but what you said gave me more ideas, like because we have an internal mantra. We also work in visualization, but for data, and our objective is that it should be so easy to create a visualization that you would create one to reply an answer and throw it away and not feel like you wasted money or time. It's just so easy that you just think with the tool and then throw it away or never use it again. And so it should be like low effort. And your Glamorous Toolkit is some sort of like REPL for organizations, in the sense that you run these queries against the system, you get replies, and like in a REPL or in a relational database, you may throw away, you don't keep the history of the queries you run. You're just thinking with the tool, and it's so low effort, or you're trying to make it so low effort that you don't say like, oh, I should save this because like it took me so much work, or maybe I will need it later. If you need it later, you write it again, because you lower the barrier to answering a question so much that you don't think about keeping those snippets of tools or small tools. So my idea was like, Glamorous Toolkit, you're trying to build like the REPL of the system, and the tools you build on top are throwaway in a sense, or not. They don't need to be reusable because they are low effort. It's like when something is so cheap to matter, you don't keep it around, basically.
Exactly.
What do you think about it? And And you mentioned like papers. So what was the evolution, your evolution? You seems you come a little bit from academia in the past, and what's your evolution? You said something like you started consulting to test your hypothesis. It was to be like closer to where the tools you were building had more impact, and you wanted to use them in more real complex ways to really test it in the ground. And do you feed back to the paper side of things? How do you feel your role is on feeding back to where you were in the past?
Yeah, so we wanted to, I wanted to be able, I wanted to see how we can help. So I noticed this problem with the what people were feeling about legacy systems, that it was it had all these significant negative feelings associated with it, and that's, I thought that's I think we can do better. I didn't know exactly how, and so I just wanted to figure out what parts work or what wouldn't work. But I do believe that it's very important. So, for even today, we see papers being written about visualizing this or that. And I still think that they missed the point because they asked the wrong question. And I would have not known the question should I have not look at the real world. I think it's very important to eventually go and have that feedback loop into any kind of research that that wants to eventually be real. There's research which is sometimes less easy to validate, or but even there, right? You want to challenge this idea that the problem you think you're solving has some sort of interestingness to it. And it's easy to convince yourself that what you're doing has value, but it's still, and there's also the other side, right? When you're doing something which is against the it's against the commonly you or accepted problems, but and then convince yourself that, well, what I'm doing is just totally wrong, right? So it's a fine game to, or it's a fine line to walk. And I don't necessarily have the perfect answer there, but I do believe it's important, if you can, to go this extra little step, take this extra step to look into the reality and see how would this affect anything in there. On the other hand, there's also this other problem. So a decade ago, building tools in academia was not, or 15 years ago, it was not, there was no incentives associated with that. So we actually built this platform, which was completely built by basically students, with no extra funding associated with this, which is called Moose. The project still goes on, and I led it for more than a decade, and it involved, I don't know, about 40, 50 PhD students across time. It supported several hundred publications of several hundred papers. So it was a significant undertaking. But the more interesting thing there was how to fit all that engineering into a funding, the world which does not fund that engineering, which is a challenge, right? And this goes back to your question, like, what's that space, right, in between what is being funded and as a research, and what you might need to do in order to get that research out there. So for example, in order to reason about the system of, I don't know, few million lines of code. You need to deal with that size of the system. So if you don't deal with that size, then it doesn't matter how interesting your analysis is. You will not be able to see it on that system. So you definitely benefit from having an engineer platform. At the same time, if you're spending all your time on engineering, which is not insignificant because it can be really expensive, you might not get to answering any interesting questions. So it's difficult. It's kind of a difficult problem. So the way we solved that one, for example, was we paired clients and providers together. So let's say if somebody would have, if you look at this problem in isolation, and every single PhD student, for example, has this, like when you do sports, at least when I grew up, they were teaching us to say, well, like spread your arms, right? And then everybody would spread their arms. And then we would know that we could do gymnastics without, injuring anybody else around us, right? Because we were 2 arms apart. But of course, if you're 2 arms apart, you can also not shake hands with anybody. And the PhD student is incentivized to be 2 arms apart from anybody around him or her. And so as a consequence, it's hard to see. And then you'll see, also we see it if you talk with PhD students, you'll see that there's a lot of, it can easily become lonely, this process of going through a PhD. But interesting enough is that if you go up and down, you can shake your hands with the people that are above you or below you, in terms of a chain of providers and clients. So if you're building a tool and then you can pair up with somebody that does empirical studies, and then there's a win-win situation there, for example. Or if you're building a platform and you want to go with somebody that does validates a specific technique on top of that platform, there's a win-win situation there. So this is how we basically dealt with that side, right? And then so if you enlarge the scope of the platform, and all of a sudden there is a room to play, there is a way to play it, but you have to think about the problem. Like the space is different. There's no longer here's a PhD student, here's a PhD, here's another one, that just tiny individual tracks, but you're now looking at the whole thing. And then there's always in between things. The other thing that we've noticed was that at first it was, right, you would do some effort and maybe, produce some sort of publishable result. But then once you had 3 or 4 of those in place, the 5th one was like, boom, right? Because it was very, very quick to put it together, right? It was not a linear effort. So there's an interesting growth there. Or there's a decrease of the cost of an experiment, which then leads to more questions being asked, which then leads to more interesting results that you get as a result. And so we've done this one, we bootstrapped that without having explicit funding, but there was an interesting group there. So I had 2 professors, Stefan Dukas was one and Oscar Nistras was the other one. And they were both favoring the creation of tools. They didn't consider them to be, there was an explicit culture there that favored, well, make your ideal real. And I think that's and at that time that was not pervasive. It was not a pervasive. Things have changed, luckily, and I think for a good, in a good way. And even tools now, there was a recent evolution where people introduced this idea of citing tools, which I think is very cool, and an important thing. There are little things like that that will change the impact. So in my case, like literally the exposure or growing up in a place where you building a tool is not a waste, could basically favored a certain evolution that otherwise would have been difficult in other places, right? So so yeah, that was there. Now there's the question, the other one is, how do you make these tools, right? So you were talking about, is Glamorous Toolkit, how do we reuse Glamorous Toolkit? The way we reuse it is by or the way we look at this is that we don't look at Glamorous Toolkit as a tool, but as a language, which has many multiple components, can be expanded in many ways, but it's essential for us so that the Glamorous Toolkit itself was built following this idea that it has to become explainable. So if I open Glamorous Toolkit, there'll be, you know, 1,000, more than 1,000, I don't know, I think it's 1,500 by now, views, right? Just custom views in the system. These are on top of those, maybe an order of magnitude more views that we have thrown away just over the course of, and it's not a large system for what it does. And the way you can get it to be like that is by basically looking at operators, right? So we don't build features. We never build features. We build, we say, well, what's the language? How do I describe that one? And then how do I visualize that one? So for example, you know, what the kinds of work that you're doing in InstaDeck is, which kind of I got to see recently, is interesting because you're also looking for a uniform language through which to describe those activities, right? And then the question that you're saying, like the activity of going from some data to some sort of visualization, and then target it to people that do not understand necessarily what programming means. And I think it's a very interesting exercise. Right, and I very much liked your perspective of saying, well, yeah, this should be a way of thinking, right? But that's that switch. That's a big switch. It's a complete different way of thinking. This is not the same. It looks the same, but it's not the same. Completely different, in fact. And what we're trying to do with Glamorous Toolkit, we're showing that the same thing that works for a non-programmer works for a programmer. So until now, people have seen data science as being a separate thing from engineering. And then we see people, oh, what kind of engineering principles do we put in data science? But they are not the same. They are not different spaces. It's just a fake, just so happened that it came from different places, but there's no distinction between them. And so what we're showing with Glamorous Toolkit is that all of those things that people think to need about data, they need it for software. There's no difference. And then so the tooling shouldn't be different either, because it's exactly the same space. There's no, so, and again, like that's a, and so, but even more interesting is what happens on top of that. So what happened, how do you then think, how do you rethink your organization to deal with the ability of answering questions about your system pretty much in real time? What happens then, right? So how do you optimize for decision making? And what happens when the business side of your system becomes understandable for non-technical people? Right. So there's a lot, right? And then the ultimate goal eventually will be so that is something that, you know, I think that I call software environmentalism. So it's this challenge of the problem today is that we create more and more, like the body of software grows super linearly year over year, but at the same time we're unable to recycle all systems, and this is not sustainable. So that's a big problem, right? And the bottleneck there is our ability to reason about our systems, and that's what we need to unblock. And then, because the next generation, we cannot build a world, and we're reshaping the whole world on top of software. But today, that software is a black box, even for people that work on it. That doesn't make any sense. And it's not sustainable, right? But so we should not accept that the next generation will inherit two worlds that are broken. We messed up the real world, and now we're gonna mess up the second one. And this, like we have to put it on a trajectory that is sustainable. So that's a problem. And then the other interesting thing about it is that we can smile inside the software system. It can become a beautiful place. Like today, people are just, they're associated with just some costs that have to be dealt with, but there's no reason. Inside the software system can be really, really beautiful. And yeah.
Yeah, it's really.
Okay, so
it's
you
really
had another.
interesting.
Finally, you had another question. So, how do we feedback? And do we feedback with? Yeah, we work with researchers. Still, we consider our work as being research. We do not necessarily publish actively, but we encourage people to use. It's a certain game that one needs to play, and we are not at the moment interested in that game. But we do encourage people that to use the platform and start, like promote it in that sense. Because what I'm very much convinced of is that there's a whole lot of, this is like a whole new space. I mean, when you think about 50% of the, we say developers spend 50% or more reading code or reading. And then like if we are correct in saying that there is a that this can be made, let's say, in order to manage the data, we just said, whoa, there's like, we talk about 50% of the software engineering could be rethought. There's a whole lot of research that can be done there, right? There's a whole lot of funding that can be gotten there. So I think that our work is an interest, or should raise an interesting opportunity for for researchers. I also think that it should raise an interesting opportunity for teachers, but that's another topic. So we don't necessarily, it's not like we occasionally publish a paper here and there. There's a great deal of the work that we've done originally on moldable development up to about 5 years ago or so, 4 or 5 years ago, we did publish. But yeah, since then we focused on producing a platform.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that you design a language.
You dropped the microphone. Dropped.
Yeah. Now, can you hear me? No. Can you hear me now? No.
Now I hear clicks.
Yeah. Now.
Yes.
No.
Now it works.
Yeah. For some reason it changes to the system microphone. I don't know. So it's interesting that you mentioned that you're designing a language and not features, because that's kind of also how I approach the design of Instag. I usually say like which are the nouns and which are the verbs, and like how do you combine them. And in some sense, what you're building with Glamorous Toolkit is a language that you can teach like the organizations you work with, so that they can speak with you and work with that language to answer questions in a sense. And also that like something Alan said, there's a difference between like building software like as a pyramid by stacking stones. It doesn't scale, and an arch where you like the amount of material you add to reach farther is much lower. And when you design this like these tools as languages, the amount of ways they can compose, and if they are designed the right way, scales much more. You don't have to keep piling features onto Glamorous Toolkit for each project or each need. Like if you find the core language of the domain, you add one feature and you add one language verb or adjective or whatever, and you open like 100 features. Because it's not one thing for one feature, it's more like combinatorial. And you say like smiling with software. There's also this thing of software being either like science or design, and Christopher Alexander, and in architecture, like creating livable places. like creating software more as a place where you can live and be happy, and not like throw it away because it's much nicer to build new stuff, because the old stuff like always gets ugly to live in, and related to recycling and reusing. So I don't know. Well, you have a good memory, so I will mention all the ideas and you remember them. And you mean recycling? And do you feel like how we build software now makes it harder to reuse, like to recycle software? And are we looking, or should we be looking for a different way of building software so that recycling and reusing is easier? And the last one, I can remind you if you forget, is regarding papers, and publishing. What's your preferred delivery artifact of the things you learn? Is it a presentation? Because if you don't like publish papers, would you prefer, or you like to deliver what you learn or feedback in another format maybe? I can remind you of the things I mentioned.
Yeah. So let's start from the Christopher Alexander perspective. Yeah, like I do believe that the inside of systems should be livable. I love a metaphor which is called software habitability by Richard Gabriel. I think that was, I read that one. That was the very first book I think I read when I started to do my PhD, and it's just stuck with me for so long. And I think it's such a beautiful perspective. It's such an interesting idea that given that we spend so much time inside software systems, for example, as developers, it should follow that the systems should be livable, should be habitable, right? And I just think it's just absolutely a beautiful thing. So by the way, like, you know, people talk today about technical debt. It dominates, that conversation dominates the interactions between technical people and business people. And, you know, when it was created 20 plus years ago, it was a very interesting, no, 30 now, but what is it? Yeah, 30 years ago. It was an interesting perspective, a very interesting perspective. But it was communicated within the context of a specific project with the goal of getting a budget for a specific activity, right? It's just that it just was, as a metaphor at the time, it was beautiful because it took these two worlds that couldn't talk to one another, and just in two, like technical and depth, where you put them together, and then you just connected two worlds that would just never talked with one another at the time. And I think it's absolutely an astonishing, you know, piece of work that pretty much everything else that Ward Cunningham has done. But at the same time, we have to outgrow it now. And the problem with that as a metaphor is that you cannot, for example, like you take that as an economic tool, you cannot obtain profit by talking about that. You know, it's a, you know, like you cannot, you know, wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, my goal today is to not have that." It's just, that's such a terrible goal to have, right? But if I'd say I wake up in the morning to make the inside of the system I live in more habitable, I think that's a beautiful thing to aspire to, or to invest your energy in. So changing the goal can actually change the way you approach that goal, right? Because if you set up yourself that the best case scenario is that nothing bad happens, that's not something that will make you smile, and it will not lead to happiness. And unhappy people are unlikely to create happy systems, and we can't afford that. So because everything, you know, the next generation will only know a world of software, and it's not a nice place to be like that. But we can change it. It's not I don't think it's difficult to change anymore. The scale will be difficult, and this leads me to another question which you were saying, like, should we build our systems differently? one of the most surprising things we found while practicing moldable development was that it changed how we build systems. But we didn't set up to say, oh, let's build systems differently. It came the other way around. So no, I don't think we should focus on changing how we build things differently. I just think that we should make those just focus on making whatever we build explainable, and they will guide us to that effort will guide us to more interesting systems that we're going to build. Right. The same thing happens with language. Like do you have features on top of features, or do you have do you see your system as a language? In fact, I think that's the largest missed opportunity. The systems are languages, or should be perceived as languages, rather than as features. And I think a whole lot of conversations about systems would change if people would understand that part. And yeah, it will also it would decrease the cost of systems dramatically, I think, if people would perceive it like this. The cost in terms of the size of a system, right? Might not make, it might still be more expensive or more difficult to build the language, or take more time, but it's a more sustainable, and it's so much more joyful. It's just uncomparable from that perspective. So yeah, no, I don't think that we should necessarily focus on, or focus now on, how to build systems differently. I think we've done that for a very long time now. Well, about as long as our domain is, that's what we've been thinking on. But we have never thought about how do we make the things that we build understandable by somebody else. So how do we decrease the cost and compress the cost and the effort needed to reason about the existing system, regardless of the form. And that's the other interesting thing. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we work with legacy systems, but we also work with new systems. We have also employed this one, for example, for driving or digging through exports of data from social networks, from social, like getting your private data and then figuring that on out. Like anybody can download their own data from Facebook or Twitter or so, but still people don't really figure it out what's in there, right? Why? It's not because the data is not available. It's because it's convoluted. There are many layers. It's not enough to just visualize the front layer, because that's not good enough. You need to go and dive through it, and that's a process. But and this one works also for new systems. That's the interesting thing. You don't need, like, for example, there's been this focus on model-driven engineering or language engineering, which focused on building if you build a tool in this way, it's going to be visualizable like that afterwards. And of course, there's always the details. Never really worked. Never quite worked. Kind of worked, but not really, right? And it only worked for some kinds of questions that people had about the system, right? So if I take, like you take this model-driven whatever system, and then people give you the architecture, you say, okay, tell me about this. How does this penetration test? Why is this one failing? Show me on your diagrams, and boom, it fails, right? Because those problems appeared because of some configuration file somewhere, right? It's not in the code, not in the actual what people thought as code. It was on somewhere else, right? So all of a sudden, all of that investment, right? It's kind of like the marginal line that the French invested in, right? And then the other ones, they decided not to go that way, and that was it. So it's kind of like that, and it never really works. But if you do it the other way around, if you invest in your ability to just reason about things, everything changes. You have a whole new feedback loop that we have not exercised as an industry. So no, I don't think we have to. I do think that there will be whole new things that we'll learn. I'm sure of that, but we shouldn't focus on that. We should focus on this whole new loop that we have never played with. Because all of these new feedback loops that have lots of applications, and they have far-reaching applicability, they also have far-reaching consequences that we don't know before we're actually playing with those. So that's what I think. Now, finally, about the how do we prefer to, to publish our work? So we think Glamorous Toolkit is first is a narrative of that's the first way in which we document the work, but now there are other pieces that will come into play as well. So the systems that we build are that's the primary way in which we publish today. So for example, if you open Glamorous Toolkit, it comes with the book inside, and of course the book is played inside of it. So, but you're also going to start to see artifacts appearing in other places being published from Glamorous Toolkit, because as I said, like even the it has consequences even on how we look at things. For example, for the personal computing perspective. So me as a person, how do I relate myself to the rest of the world? So today I'm going to go to, if I'm going to tweet something, or if people want to tweet something, they're going to go to twitter.com and then see the same interface that the 500 million other people are seeing. And the whole idea of personal computing was that it was supposed to be personal. And now we still ended up with this mass-produced experience that everybody else experiences exactly in the same way, right? Yeah, and I think that we can do much more than that. If we care about the well-being of the person that uses or interacts with our systems, we have to start from their perspectives, not from the interest of the system that we built, right? And so, for example, when I tweet long tweets, I just try managing 3 or 4 threads of tweets in Twitter, right? You can't. Everything is, you can, but it's so difficult. It's just pretty much impossible. And so no, people are not doing it, right? And they always resort to some magic tool somewhere else, right? But there's no, so if you want to write longer threads like that and publish like this, then that tool will push you not to do it. So the only other choice is to make it so that it's comfortable for you. And so that's, when we announce, for example, Lepiter, which is a new component in Glamorous Toolkit, which is about this unification of knowledge management and notebooks and development environments. We have tweeted that long thread from inside Lepiter or from inside Glamorous Toolkit because, yeah, it's just another application. So that's what we'll see. We also, I'm very much interested in looking at the development environment as being an authoring tool, and having ways to publish from there and debug and maintain your narratives from there. I think it's a relevant area. But yeah, we also like, well, I don't necessarily like, I like arguments, but they don't seem to be consumed, unfortunately. People like bite-size chunks of things that are shiny or so. So one way we publish our work is through 10-15 seconds movies that we push on social media. And again, it's just an experiment. So the experiment there, by the way, is we often show a bug or how something inside the system works, inside the system, not outside the system. And that one gets retweeted. And I get so much pleasure from there, because we can transform that thing. It just shows like when people retweet or like, right? They say, this is it's worth it for others to see this, right? And I'm just giggling, inside when I see that, well, this is just a little bug that I just had, and I visualize it in this way. And then some people, um, some people thought that this is interesting, and I think it's interesting as well. And this is so, it's just an interesting validation. But yeah, I think long form arguments are important. But there's little place, unfortunately, today, or at least that I see, where people can put together arguments even without having some hard proof validation, like just polishing a place where you can polish your hypothesis. So where even if you're right, but if it's not explained right, that's still a worthwhile feedback, and it's still a worthwhile thing to learn, right? So even if you look at papers, they say almost like we only judge the outcome of what the paper tries to convince you of, but not the form in which it tries to convince you of. And I think there's a missed opportunity there, in which we could incentivize. On the one hand, I think in our field, we should incentivize people building tools. Those should be accepted as relevant ways to publish. But on the other hand, I also think it would be very interesting to have a place where people are encouraged to reformulate what they have already formulated. I'm very much aware of the fact that this can be easily gamed or so, but there's such a difference. It can be such a difference between, things that are well said, that maybe are not even valuable, but because they are well said, they catch on, right? And then there are those things that are valuable, but because they are not well said, they do not. So they would lose that conversation. And I think I haven't seen an interesting medium for that kind of an exercise, but I think it would be an interesting one.
Yeah. So when you were working with Christopher Alexander and coming back to recycling, and that you define yourself as a software environmentalist, and you said that we are kind of ruining the real world and we are creating this new software world and we have to be careful. I was thinking like how cars, like not on purpose, but define how we live, how cities are built and how architecture evolved for a century. Nobody thought about like, we are building just this tool and this tool will define how people live for the following century. And in a sense, like how we are creating software right now may define how people live for the next century. So we have to be careful what kind of tools we create. And the other one, I think you mentioned the word narrative, and yeah, I think it's also, I wrote some names over here. You will recognize them. Let me find them. Where are they? Like Alan Kay, Brett Victor, Neil deGrasse Tyson, James Burke, Richard Feynman, Carl Sagan. Like they deliver stories, or if I want to use a cliche word, like TED Talks, as a way to grab ideas that are not known and make them known by using narrative and stories. And I think that it's interesting to think like, how can we use the power of stories? Because like normal people or society understands better when you present a story or a narrative than when you present facts or a paper. And so maybe there's a role in stories and narratives and TED Talks for academia, in a sense. Like, of course, I say cliche and TED Talks in quotes because like now TED Talks are kind of a cliche, or they don't deliver so much. They are in kind of entertainment or pop culture in a sense, but delivering the same idea in different ways, and one of them being a story, or as you said, like a small video that shows a thing generates more impact than a full blog post or a paper, because like people understand better what you're trying to say when they can see it directly, or when it's told as an anecdote. Like I guess it may have happened to you when you want to convey the usefulness of Glamorous Toolkit. People understand better. Will say, the other day I was at the customer and they had this problem, and I said this and they say that, and they say, oh, Glamorous Toolkit is really cool to solve these kind of problems. You didn't say it directly, like what Glamorous Toolkit said. You just told the story and they got it in a sense. So maybe there should be a place where we can be less formal and use what humans are good at. Like they are good at consuming content in terms of stories and narratives, and not only like in a really formal and structured way. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's I do think that stories is what we grew up, as a society for a long time. But what made us jump dramatically was the formal argument and the written argument. Um, and it's interesting how we now see, like we were warned from the previous century, from a few people already, that this, the culture of television will decreases the kinds of interactions that we can have, right? And the depth of the consequences that we can accommodate. So that that is the part that just a second. I need to just a second. So what made us jump was this ability of writing and exchanging or being able to reason about things that are not visible at first. So one of the challenges that we do see today is when people look at Glamorous Toolkit, they see what is visible on the surface. But when you have multiple layers, then that's not sufficient. And so you like people miss the point. And you need a culture which favors that depth. And today, right, we are bombarded with tools that favor shallowness. Right, there's exactly one level of things. I see something, I like it, boom, boom. Right, it's very, very primal. It works with my very primal abilities or inclinations, but it does not favor system thinking. It does not favor me disagreeing with some part of an argument, right? The whole thing is agreed or disagreed with as a whole. There's no way in which we can polish anything. Right? And so it's difficult to make progress like that. But what if we change though? What if we change the nature of the tools that we give to people? Just like how writing could change it, right? Just when writing became pervasively, printing became pervasively available, and books became pervasively available, it changed the conversation, right? And there's this exciting story about how like the around the creation of the Constitution of the United States, and it's fascinating to see there how within a short amount of time people could not only refine ideas but also populate them to a very wide audience, which is astonishing for that time, right? And it's something that we are not able to do today, which is interesting. So, but I strongly believe that, yes, it's like you were mentioning, like how the cars, influenced or shape the structure of cities and our relationship with the space around us. The same way tools should do that, like just like what Marshall McLuhan used to say. And we are seeing this, for example, when we are doing this Glamorous toolkit or we're working on it. The Glamorous toolkit is built on top of Smalltalk. Smalltalk already showed what is possible when you change the nature of the environment to the development environment or the environment in which you program. But even Smalltalk, it didn't, like, so we still see it didn't go that extra step of just saying, like, what if everything is easily explained? What if every object is easily visualizable? What happens then? It was always possible. It was just not pervasively possible. And so once we have gone to that, once we added that ability, a whole new, we just started to think differently. And we still are surprised by the kinds of things that we are able to do. And we were not thinking about being able to do. And so, coming back, for example, to this conversation with Twitter, just this ability of having, being able to trace my own threads in inside the maybe I should share inside my own development environment. It's just a simple thing, but it changed the nature in which, for example, I publish things on Twitter, which is not a big, it's not a reference for anything. It's just a little exercise. But I'm very much convinced that if we change how the kinds of tools that we give to individuals rather than to masses, and how we empower an individual, this will, like, how do we empower the individual to go beyond what is immediately visible? How do you navigate through the maze of whether this is a system, whether for the data about the system, produced with the system? If we can do that, we can actually change the conversation. I'm very much convinced that this is possible. So just let me find some.
Yeah, for example, one thing that Twitter makes really hard is to follow a conversation that branches a lot. So when I'm reading a conversation from other people in Twitter, I never know how much of the conversation I read because of the branching and the replies.
Yeah.
So I would love to build a tool that showed me three and allowed me to, like, maybe flatten it or maybe navigate it in a better way, higher level way. And I like the activation energy of creating that tool is so hard. I say I'm not even going to try.
Right. So here is I have here, I just opened Glamorous Toolkit and I have a little snippet here which says, well, find me those places that have a Twitter snippet in there. So find me those pages in my knowledge base, right? So now this is a query, gives me a set of objects. And for example, this is something that I tweeted not too long ago. This is a page. And so this is something that I haven't tweeted yet. This is something that I want to tweet. And so this is now a thread. And so I might want to tweet those. So I can now tweet it from here if I want to, but I'm not going to do that because it's not ready yet. This is another one in which this is actually tweeted a while ago. So this is 191 days ago, but I still have somewhere here. I still have an empty thing that I would like to say something else. So, and I could just go ahead and tweet this right now from here. So that's and again, like these are all the threads that I have in work at the moment, right? So this is something that I tweeted recently, 12 days ago, but I still would like to continue in some way. here, that thread, but it's just, I'm not finished yet. So I can do this, I can work with these little arguments in my space without being bombarded by the immediacy of what the Twitter interface wants me to act on. Like, oh, there's a notification here. Oh, there's a new tweet over there, and I'm not. That's not the interesting thing here. This is a different medium from which I I explore the system. So yeah, that's a it's another way basically um, to deal with this.
Yeah, that's great. Like, well, what I've experienced many times is probably you didn't experience this in a while because of Glamorous Toolkit, that sometimes you have an idea and you either like start trying to like you give yourself a couple of hours to prototype the idea, and at the end of the time you didn't manage to install the libraries or to understand how to use the libraries, or
Right.
you learned from your past experiences and say, no, this idea is too small for the amount of effort it takes to prototype it. And like what you're building is a tool that allows more ideas to be realized without getting stuck, or like the amount of energy required per prototype is getting smaller and smaller.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one. So you mentioned this idea, right? Did I say, oh, I have a thread and I would like to see, so this is now I posted here a link to from a Twitter. So I have a Twitter thing and I'm inspecting this tweet. And one of the views of that tweet is a conversation.
That's great.
And of course, like if it's a tweet like this, then I can also just in the inspector, I can go on and say, and I can go and tweet it from here. But basically, this is how we can keep track of did I answer this one? Did I answer that one? Or just figure our way out in that conversation. Again, it's nothing large, but that was a need I had when I wanted to navigate larger threads. So we built a little tool for that.
Yeah, that's great. That's what I love about the idea of Glamorous Toolkit, and what you mentioned, that like people may see it and think it's an IDE or it's a Smalltalk IDE. So like, and it's the problem of like it's usually how people like approach new things. They try to relate them to things they already know. But the problem is that if they stay there, or if you don't find a way to explain them how it's different, they get the wrong impression or a shallow impression of what you're building. But I think it also relates to like you're creating a new like segment in a sense, Moldable development. So you're doing three things at once, which is impressive, which is like you're doing research into a new area, you're doing like industry, or you're creating a company and a product, but you are also trying to teach people about a new idea, which is Moldable development, and to companies about a new process or a new way to build and understand things. So do you have something to share in terms of how do you approach teaching people a new idea, a new concept, a new process, or is there a trick? Because or you try to relate to things that exist. For example, like now there's this idea of no code, low code, and sometimes like it's much easier to say like we do it, like we are no code for data science, because people know no code, people know data science. Maybe at least I don't have to, if I have 5 minutes, or if they are only seeing a tweet, at least they are going to get an idea of what we are doing. But you created a new concept, which is Moldable development. Like, how do you approach like educating people on this new idea?
So first of all, we take a long perspective. So I think we need another 5 to 10 years for it to work as a concept. But it's not, Moldable development is not is not yet a successful, it's not a successful concept on the market, right? I know or I'm very much convinced that it has value, but especially compared to what exists today, but that we still need, a million people to think the same way until we can say, well, this was interesting. So how did you do it, right? So we have no idea what we're doing. We're just doing. But it's like everything we've done. We just worked ourselves backwards. We just say, oh, what's the outcome? That is the outcome. I don't like this. I don't like this current situation. So what needs to happen for it not to have a chance to not get to this situation? So you work yourself backwards. And so if the goal is to make systems explainable, right? We're not going to be the ones building those systems, and we're not going to be the ones explaining all of those systems. The only other way is to have people explain their own system. So, so you have to say, okay, so what needs to happen? Well, we need to teach them to do it differently. Okay, how do you teach them? Well, first of all, you need to so they have something to practice on. Okay, great. So we have that one. What about something else? Well, then you need to also show what's the business value that comes from it. Because if you don't align, if you're only talking about things that are cool, that can be okay. Well, things that are, morally interesting, that can be okay. But if you align it with economic incentives, then all of a sudden you say, you have a different, it's a much more convincing argument. But then that's not enough, right? Because you still need to say, well, how do you teach? How do you teach this? And now what's interesting here is that we're doing, I think, interesting research into how do you teach programming. So the question here is, right, we have maybe 50 million developers or something, different estimations, right? Well, do we focus on the 50 million or do we focus on the next 100 million? So which of those are more likely to catch onto this, right? So again, like if you take a long enough perspective, you don't have to act on the immediate. And so one thing we don't do is we do not associate ourselves with the concepts that exist, because the concepts that I see today, they are diminishing. So they will not stay. They can make money, but they will not solve problems. And I'm interested in solving the actual problem. And I'm not saying that we know how to do all of it, because it's just like a very large thing to have. But it's so if you don't pose yourself that problem, there's little chance for it to happen. Right? So I'm interested in the outcome. How we get there, I don't know exactly, but that's how we're saying. Like, so for example, if you just take a look at what's happening in the AI world, or not in the AI world, but with AI, right? So like people talking today about making AI explainable and how important that one is. And of course, that's always been important, but what chances do we have to explain AI when we cannot explain simple systems, right? It's just it's not the right, like you don't have the foundation is not right. We have to have solid foundation, and explaining AI is not different than explaining a system. So don't start with the fifth problem, start with the first problem, make that one solid, and then we build on it.
Look what you say, like what you said with software, like if you create software that is easy to explain, it will design itself the right way. Like when I ask you if we should design software another way to make it composable, they're like, if you start with the objective of making software or AI explainable or habitable, then it will design itself the right way so that you achieve that objective.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that's the problem basically that we have.
So as a summary of the question from the beginning, and the question that kicked off this conversation, like academia and industry and the place in between, in a sense, what you said before, like there's a short-term incentive in academia, which is like publish or perish in a sense, and there's a short-term incentive in industry, which is like the capitalist like short-term return of investment, and you are taking the long terms. So basically you're not aligning yourself with any of the incentives of both sides. And to be able to do that, you have to be able to survive. Otherwise you cannot do the long-term thing. So that's why you are doing like, that's why you are where you are, like in between, because like you want to take a new idea and make it like a success. And for that you need like ideas, but also funding. So I guess, I don't know if you agree with that you are in a sense in the middle or in another dimension or something.
Yeah, so unfortunately today there's no, if you look at what happened when some major leaps happened, those were typically correlated with imaginative funding. That was, and the funding was not associated with the promise of a result. It was associated with the soundness of the intent, which is not the same thing. So it's how interesting the problem is, or how interesting you formulate the problem is more relevant, I think, right? And the process maybe by which you're tackling a problem, but not the outcome. Because you just like, if you want to generate something that is really completely new, you cannot evaluate the outcome. It's just not gonna happen. So yeah, we fund ourselves by actually solving real problems, but we basically do it with the knowledge we had 5 years ago. So, and in the process, yeah, with more, but basically that's what we're promising. We don't promise the state of the art of today. We promise what happened, what already happened. So we are in a kind of a luxury situation from that perspective, because it so happens that what we build actually solves problems. So it's not just, yeah, we're not just saying it, or maybe we're just very good sellers. I don't know. We actually, I would like to encourage other people to do the same. Like take what we are saying and start your own business. And there's just so many things to explain. There's so many systems to explain. This is just not a shortage of, this is not a, it's not a winner takes all type of market. It's just gonna, I think there's lots of opportunity for many people, and especially interesting for people that are worried about what's going to happen once computers are writing programs for us. Right? That this problem of figuring the system out, and this problem will just become more and more obvious, right? As less and less people are familiar with what has been written in the system in the first place, then they will not even have the impression that they will know, because the system has just wrote some whatever, or they just completed, right? If you look at what what is it, like GitHub Copilot proposes as, it's absolutely interesting thing, but it's just basically the copy paste from Stack Overflow on steroids, which is just, it's just that's exactly how people have built systems that they don't know anymore. And so the problem is not how you're writing this new line of code. The problem is how do you decide whether the completion is exactly what you're interested in? That's the interesting story. And that is not,
how you read back, right, all the completions, like a month from now, how you come back to all that code that you didn't even wrote yourself, you just have to complete it, and how you make sense of that code.
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying, like, it's basically everybody is in that situation, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's somebody else that wrote it or I wrote it a year ago. I still don't remember exactly what I wrote there, probably, and definitely if somebody else wrote it and maybe changed a little bit, I have to go and reason about that thing. So whether it's going to be a completion or they wrote it, that's not going to change the problem from that perspective. But there's an in-between moment that is just never advertised, right? So you do the next completion, there's a line, and there's right between right between the moment the completion appears and somebody presses enter, that's the space, right? Why do you say that's the completion that is interesting? Why that one and not some other one that maybe is not offered, or maybe it's offered, but I have to search differently for it? That's the interesting question. And that's what we need to change. And by the way, like all of these people, like that's where anyway, right now, the effort is being spent. Like that completion thing, is optimizing the little tiny percentage that people actually spend writing code. And it's just not the thing that will generate any meaningful that's not the thing that will generate new systems that are fundamentally better. So there's a whole lot of new opportunities completely unexplored in this other space, which is just accommodates, which is the real bottleneck today. We don't have a bottleneck of writing systems. We have a bottleneck of figuring out systems. And that's what we want to do. So
and there's an old joke that I think it's fitting, that I think Bill Gates said it, like measuring software by lines of code is like measuring planes by weight. And what this tool does basically is just adds lines of code, a lot of lines of code. And yeah, and it tells something about the tools. Like if the only way to go further is to just add more stuff, and maybe we need to rethink going back to the pyramid and the bridge. Maybe we are at the wrong level of abstraction. If the tool can generate 20 lines of code, maybe it should be one line of code. And it's what you meant, like the time when you decide that that's the correct auto-completion, we should be writing that, not the 20 lines of code. And
yeah.
And going back to what you said, that you're doing, like what you're providing to your customers is what you knew 5 years ago. And I'm going back to Warley a lot, but he has an article that talks about pioneers, settlers, and town planners. And in a sense, you're trailing academia by 5 years, but you're I would say in the future for industry. In a sense, you are 5 years in the
no,
future
I mean
industry.
I didn't mean what academia knew 5 years ago. I mean what we knew. Yeah,
but in a sense it's kind of frontier research, in a sense, what you're doing. But what you're providing to others is what you already are sure you can deliver on.
Yeah, and the reason we're doing this, so this is not the best, it's not the most interesting setup that I can imagine. It's just more the practical one that we could put in place. The reason we decouple this, like the reason we are not selling what we haven't built yet, really, is because we would like to not constrain the kinds of research that we want to do by the things that we've already promised. So, and it's kind of in the same way as, like if I open my calendar, it's basically open. Like I don't have, there's no schedule anything in there. Internally, we have no meetings because there's no reason for, like, that's going to be a constraint. It's also a bottleneck. We can talk about that some other time. But so those constraints, they will put you, like, you make promises about the future about which you don't know, and by the time you get there, you might have more interesting things you might want to do. So if you sell that future, it can be an expensive and maybe dangerous bet, basically. And that's the type of bet that we prefer not to make. So we don't want to sell that one in this way. That's why we are not a kind of like a solution provider in the typical sense. Yeah, so but when we work with customers, we want to solve their problems, but we kind of take those. Sometimes we work with new and challenging things, but very often there's a solution that we deploy They were knowable 5 years ago. We would know them. We would know kind of what they are, in a sense. And so we're not going to promise something new. We might create things that are new, but we just never promise those. And we actually do create things that are new, right? But and then this adds more value, but it's not what we start from. And that for me is important. So this the nature of funding is so, it's something that I'm particularly keen on preserving. Like the funding should not constrain what people want to work on or what they think is interesting at that moment in time. And so that's basically the setup. So now, and the way we are funding, right? It says we basically spend maybe less than we don't spend a full amount of time working on external projects. Obviously, we're just work on external projects as much as it's needed to fund ourselves. But we spend the largest chunk of our time probably working on our internal, or the kinds of things that we want to do. And that will create the next level of value. So yeah, that's kind of how it is. So, talking about, trailing, or is this research or is it not research? I think it's research. But, at the end of the day, there's that difference between, some people say that it's not possible to do research and develop a product. And I think there is truth to that, right? But the question is, what do you sell? Do you sell the future of that one? Did you already sell the future of the product, or do you sell the past of the product? And if you sell the past of the product, that maybe there's a chance. But in any case, until now, we are funding ourselves through the services that we sell. So we spend some extra time doing some other work, which also turns out to be validation. So because all the projects we do employ the kinds of things that the tools and techniques that we put forward, they also become validation for those tools and techniques. So it's kind of like what you would do when one would do when saying, oh, I have a research idea, I'm going to go and test it in real life and then see, does it work or does it not work? So kind of that's at least what we have found. It's not the most, maybe it's not the most robust form of funding, but it's just what we found.
And so you do you do a split between what you provide to fund and what you are working with your customers right now and what you're working on the research side right now. Is the people doing the research also the people doing the work with customers? How this intersection of it's
yes.
the same. So they get really like short feedback loops because they are doing the research, but they are also working with customers.
Yeah, in our case, it is like that. That's why I'm saying it's not the most ideal form of funding that I can imagine or that I have heard of. But it's the funding that we could put in place. So there's definitely bias in how we work, because you build your own thing and you test you test it yourself, so that it kind of get to the point in which, oh yeah, it works, right? But does it work for others? I don't know. So that part is not, and the kinds of things that we see in practice, so the kinds of projects that we are able to get are also gonna provide a certain biased perspective on the reality of the kinds of challenges that we have to meet until we make systems explainable. That's another source of bias. So there's a significant amount of and also there's also a bias towards favoring a complete solution, favoring an engineered solution, while maybe in some circumstances perhaps maybe it would be better to just drop it and start again or something like that. We do throw away the largest chunk of our code that we produce. We probably throw away about 2/3 of the code that we produce. So we routinely re-implement parts of the system, not because we want to. It's just because there's the language was not right. We kind of well, let's try it like that. And sometimes we do it. Well, we come back or maybe find something in between. But for example, for the graphical stack, we probably went through 4 or 5 generations over 5 years. That during which the largest chunk of the code was rewritten. So
yeah, that's cool. You say that like your current setup is not the optimal way of funding, but I find that the need to provide value in order to get the funding for your research keeps you really close to solving real problems. Like if I gave you like $50 million and you go like architectural astronaut on Moldable development, you may get detached from actual real problems and real people. In a sense, I mean, it may not be the ideal. It may be nicer if you had more resources, but the fact that you all the time have to be solving real problems, I think it's a great signal to the tool or the processes you're building, because you always have to be solving real problems. You cannot like detach a lot.
yeah, there is a benefit there indeed. But for example, the time selling is not that's not it's not the most ideal way of using time, but it's a necessary part of it. And as I said, like the question is, what problems do you solve? So we want to be in a situation where we're bombarded with 10 different problems and we pick, I want to solve that one because it adds a new kind of variable that I haven't looked at, or kind of things like that, right? And you're not always in that situation, so you cannot always choose the kinds of problems that you're gonna, right? So that you're gonna tackle. So having more freedom there to figuring out the problems can be beneficial, I think. So as I said, I think that there are other setups that would be more interesting. And also, like if you look at other systems like the DARPA or the what happened at Park Place, that was a significant amount of funding, and there's a significant freedom to build what was unimaginable at the time in a short amount of time, but also at the significant costs without actually being able to evaluate the outcome, right? And that's I think that's probably the most ideal, or it's closer to the ideal, but yeah.
Yeah, it's what it is. Yeah, one of the things I noticed, but we are running over time for you, I guess. It's yes. Yeah, it's the research lab, industrial research lab we lost, like Bell Labs, Park, and stuff like that. That was kind of the space in between, but maybe they, like the United States China thing right now reignites the reasons why those research labs existed, which was maybe the Cold War in a sense. Yeah, that's more ideal than having to bootstrap a business to fund research, as if there's something like a research lab that can fund that kind of research. So yeah, but yeah, it's the way it is, and you're doing pretty well in a sense. I think you're influencing conversations in many places, maybe more than you realize, with the tools and the things you present, and it's working. And as you say, it may take 5-10 years, but I think it's working. At least for me. I don't know. I cannot speak for more people, but okay. It's really interesting the work you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, thanks for your time and all your answers, and I hope it was interesting for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the conversations and for all the questions. I just hope that I covered some of them.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't miss.
No, because
I didn't
I
miss
throw
too
away
many.
like 5 or 6 ideas after you say something and you remember all
You're
of them
muted
and you
again.
reply them all. It's impressive. I don't have that memory. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.